Let's get weird into it. Number 8. The Great Emu War. Imagine you are a veteran of World War I. You have survived the trenches, the mustard gas, and the artillery barrages that turned Europe into a muddy hellscape. You return home to Australia, the land of sunshine and dangerous spiders, expecting a quiet life farming wheat. You are given land by the government. You plant your crops. You wait for the harvest. And then, you hear a sound like thunder rolling across the plains. But it isn't a storm. It is 20,000 flightless, dinosaur-looking birds, sprinting at 30 miles per hour, fueled by chaos and a hunger for your livelihood. This was the reality in Western Australia in 1932. A massive migration of emus decided that the cultivated wheat farms looked a lot like an all-you-can-eat buffet. The farmers, realizing that scarecrows don't work on birds that are taller than a human and have claws like velociraptors, did the logical thing. They called the Minister of Defense. The government decided that this was a military operation. They sent Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery, accompanied by 2 soldiers armed with Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. They expected a turkey shoot. They expected to turn the emus into feather dusters within an afternoon. What they got was a masterclass in guerrilla warfare from animals with brains the size of walnuts. When the soldiers opened fire, the emus didn't just stand there. They split into small, scattered squads, running in chaotic patterns that made aiming impossible. The birds were seemingly bulletproof. One soldier noted that unless you hit them directly in the head, they would just keep running, shrugging off machine gun fire like it was a gentle breeze. At one point, the military tried mounting a machine gun on a truck to chase the birds, but the terrain was so rough that the gunner couldn't fire without biting his own tongue off, and the emus simply outran the vehicle. After a week of fighting, the military had expended thousands of rounds of ammunition to kill a statistically insignificant number of birds. The media mocked them relentlessly. The emus, meanwhile, continued to eat the wheat, unimpressed by the might of the British Commonwealth. The army withdrew in disgrace, having lost a war to an enemy that couldn't even fly. Number 7. The War of the Bucket. If you think modern sports rivalries are intense, they are practically tea parties compared to medieval Italy. In the 14th century, Italy wasn't a country. It was a patchwork of city-states that hated each other with the burning passion of 1,000 suns. 2 of these neighbors, Bologna and Modena, were looking for any excuse to kill each other. They had political differences. Bologna supported the Pope, and Modena supported the Holy Roman Emperor. But honestly, they just enjoyed the violence. The breaking point came in 1325. Under the cover of darkness, a group of Modenese soldiers sneaked into the city center of Bologna. They didn't steal the crown jewels. They didn't kidnap a duke. They didn't burn down the archives. They went to the main city well and stole a bucket. Just a wooden bucket. An oak bucket with iron hoops, probably smelling of stagnant water and moss. When the Bolognese woke up and realized their municipal hydration vessel was missing, they didn't just write it off as a prank. They were insulted. They demanded the bucket's return. Modena refused. Naturally, Bologna declared war. This wasn't a skirmish. Bologna mustered an army of 32,000 men. Modena scraped together about 7,000. They met at the Battle of Zappolino, one of the bloodiest battles in medieval Italian history. For an entire afternoon, nearly 40,000 people hacked each other to pieces in a field. Against all odds, the outnumbered Modenese army crushed the Bolognese forces. They chased them all the way back to the gates of Bologna, destroying castles along the way. And just to rub salt in the wound, the Modenese soldiers took a second bucket from a well outside the city walls. About 2,000 men died that day. And the prize? The original bucket is still on display in the bell tower of the cathedral in Modena. It has been there for nearly 700 years. A rotting piece of wood that cost thousands of lives, sitting there mocking the human race for its pettiness. Number 6. The War of the Stray Dog. Politics is a delicate game of chess, where one wrong move can topple kings. Or sometimes it's a game of fetch gone horribly wrong. Let's take you to 1925. The border between Greece and Bulgaria. Tensions are incredibly high. These 2 nations have been at each other's throats since the Second Balkan War and World War I. There are skirmishes. Border patrols are twitchy, and everyone is waiting for a spark. That spark came in the form of a dog. According to the most popular version of the story, a Greek soldier stationed at the border was guarding his post when his dog ran off. The dog, being a dog, did not respect international treaties or geopolitical boundaries, and ran right across the line into Bulgarian territory. The Greek soldier, perhaps forgetting that he was in a powder keg, chased after his pet. Bulgarian sentries saw a Greek soldier charging into their territory. They didn't see a man looking for a puppy. They saw an invasion. They opened fire, killing the Greek soldier. When news reached the Greek leadership, They didn't send a diplomatic note. They sent the army. The Greek dictator, Theodoros Pangalos, ordered an invasion of Bulgaria. Greek forces occupied the town of Petrich, shelled the area, and prepared for a full-scale offensive. The League of Nations, the dollar store version of the United Nations, had to frantically intervene. They eventually ordered a ceasefire and fined Greece for the invasion. Greece withdrew, grumbling about hypocrisy. By the time the dust settled, over 50 people were dead. 50 human lives were extinguished because a dog wanted to sniff a tree in a different country. We don't know what happened to the dog, but history hopes he was a very good boy, because the price of his walk was an international conflict. Number 5. The Pig War. If you thought the dog war was stupid, let me introduce you to the pig that almost started World War III between the United States and Great Britain. The year is 1859. We are in the San Juan Islands, a cluster of islands between Vancouver Island and the U.S. mainland. Due to a poorly worded treaty, both the British and the Americans claimed these islands, so they decided to share them. British employees of the Hudson's Bay Company lived on one side. American settlers lived on the other. It was a tense, passive-aggressive roommate situation. One morning, an American farmer named Lyman Cutler walked out to his garden and found a large black pig rooting up his potatoes. This wasn't the first time. Cutler lost his temper, raised his rifle, and shot the pig dead. It turned out the pig belonged to an Irishman named Charles Griffin, who ran the British sheep ranch. Cutler offered $10 as compensation. Griffin demanded $100. Cutler said, "The pig was eating my potatoes." Griffin replied with the legendary line, "It is up to you to keep your potatoes out of my pig." Cutler withdrew his offer. The British authorities threatened to arrest him. The American settlers called for military protection. The U.S. Army sent Captain George Pickett, who would later become famous for a very bad charge during the Civil War, with 66 soldiers. The British responded by sending 3 warships. The escalation was insane. Within weeks, there were nearly 500 U.S. soldiers with cannons dug into the island, staring down 5 British warships with over 2,000 men and heavy artillery. The orders were to fire if fired upon. The commander of the British fleet was ordered to land troops and engage, but he refused, famously saying he would not involve 2 great nations in a war over a squabble about a pig. They stood in a standoff for months. Eventually, news reached Washington and London. The leaders were horrified that they were about to go to war over bacon. They negotiated a joint military occupation that lasted for 12 years until the border was finalized. The only casualty of the entire conflict was the pig. Number 4. The War of Jenkins Ear. You might think this title is a metaphor. It is not. This is a war named after a specific man's detached auditory organ. In the early 18th century, the Spanish were allowed to search British ships in the Caribbean to check for smugglers. The British, being British, were absolutely smuggling things. In 1731, a Spanish patrol boat boarded a British brig called the Rebecca, captained by Robert Jenkins. The Spanish Coast Guard accused Jenkins of smuggling. Tensions rose. The Spanish commander drew his sword and sliced off Robert Jenkins's left ear. He then handed the severed ear to Jenkins and told him to take it to his king, and tell him that the Spanish would do the same to him if he were there. Jenkins, presumably in shock and missing a crucial part of his head, pickled his own ear in a jar of alcohol. He kept it for 7 years. 7 years later, tensions between Britain and Spain were flaring up again over trade rights. Jenkins was invited to Parliament. He stood up in the House of Commons, produced the jar, and displayed his shriveled, pickled ear to the lawmakers. The visual aid worked. The outrage was instantaneous. Britain declared war on Spain in 1739. This wasn't a small skirmish. It merged into the larger War of the Austrian Succession and became a global conflict involving massive naval battles, thousands of deaths, and shifting colonial borders. It lasted nearly a decade. Thousands of sailors died of yellow fever and cannon fire. Fleets were sunk, and economies were strained, all because a guy kept his body part in a jar like a weird souvenir and waited for the perfect dramatic moment to reveal it. Number 3. The Pastry War. France takes its food seriously. If you insult a croissant, you are insulting the Republic. In 1838, they proved this by launching a naval blockade over a bakery. Mexico, in the early years of its independence, was a chaotic place. Governments changed hands constantly, usually through violent coups and looting. During one of these riots in Mexico City, a French pastry chef named Remontel had his shop ransacked by looting officers. Remontel was furious. He filed a complaint with the Mexican government, demanding compensation. They ignored him. So, he appealed to the French king, Louis Philippe. But Remontel didn't just ask for the cost of the flour and sugar. He demanded 60,000 pesos. To put that in perspective, a typical daily wage was less than 1 peso. He was asking for a fortune for his cakes. France, looking for an excuse to flex its muscles and collect on other unpaid Mexican debts, decided to back the baker. They demanded Mexico pay 600,000 pesos in total. When Mexico refused, the French fleet sailed across the Atlantic, blockaded the port of Veracruz, and started bombarding the fortress of San Juan de Ulua. Mexico declared war. The famous General Santa Anna, who had retired in disgrace after losing Texas, came out of retirement to lead the defense. In a bizarre twist, Santa Anna was hit by cannon fire during the fighting and lost his leg. He gave the leg a full military funeral with honors years later, because narcissism is a powerful drug. Eventually, the British intervened diplomatically. Mexico agreed to pay the 600,000 pesos. The French fleet sailed home. Remontel got his money. It was the most expensive pastry bill in human history, paid for with blood, a general's leg, and a ruined economy. Number 2. The Football War. We often say sports are like a war, but in 1969, El Salvador and Honduras took that literally. These two Central American neighbors had deep-seated issues regarding land reform and immigration. Hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans had moved into Honduras to farm, creating massive social tension. The media in both countries were whipping up nationalist frenzy. Then came the qualifiers for the 1970 FIFA World Cup. They had to play a 3-game series. The first game was in Honduras. Honduras won, and violence broke out between fans. The second game was in El Salvador. El Salvador won, and the violence got worse. Honduran fans were attacked, their cars burned. The final game was played in Mexico to keep them apart, and El Salvador won in extra time. Within days of the final match, El Salvador dissolved diplomatic ties and launched a ground and air invasion of Honduras. This became known as the 100-Hour War. It was a strange conflict because both sides were using obsolete American equipment from World War II. You had F-4U Corsairs and P-51 Mustangs dogfighting in the sky, propeller planes fighting the last piston-engine air battles in history. The Salvadoran army pushed rapidly into Honduras, but their supply lines stalled. The Organization of American States threatened severe sanctions, and a ceasefire was called after 4 days. Roughly 3,000 people died. Most of them were civilians. The border was closed, trade stopped, and the economies of both nations were devastated for over a decade. El Salvador did go to the World Cup that year, where they lost every single game and failed to score a single goal. A bittersweet reward for a war sparked by a soccer ball. Number 1. The War of the Golden Stool. Cultural misunderstandings are usually awkward. You bow when you should shake hands. You wear shoes inside when you shouldn't. But in 1900, a cultural misunderstanding regarding a piece of furniture led to a vicious guerrilla war. The British Empire was trying to gain control over the Ashanti Empire in what is now Ghana. The British had exiled the Ashanti king, but the people were still resisting colonial rule. The governor of the Gold Coast, Sir Frederick Hodgson, decided he needed to assert dominance. He called a meeting with the Ashanti chiefs. He demanded that they bring out the Golden Stool. To the Ashanti, the Golden Stool was not a chair. It was the sacred vessel of the nation's soul. It was so holy that it was never allowed to touch the ground. And, crucially, no one was allowed to sit on it, not even the king. The king would just pretend to sit near it during coronation. Hodgson didn't know this or didn't care. He gave a speech asking, "Why am I not sitting on the Golden Stool at this very moment? I am the representative of Queen Victoria. Why have you relegated me to this ordinary chair?" A heavy silence fell over the crowd. The Ashanti chiefs went home, prepared their muskets, and immediately declared war. Led by the Queen Mother, Ya Asantewa, a badass grandmother in her 60s, the Ashanti besieged the British in their fort for months. The British had to bring in thousands of troops and artillery to break the siege. It was a brutal conflict with high casualties on both sides. The British eventually won militarily and annexed the territory. But here is the kicker. They never got the stool. The Ashanti hid it deep in the forest. It remained hidden for decades. The British had conquered the land, but because one guy wanted a fancy seat he wasn't entitled to, they faced a rebellion that cost them millions and shattered their reputation in the region. The Golden Stool is still in Ghana today, and nobody sits on it. And that's our time for today. More strange things are always coming, so I'll see you in the next one.